What's up, guys? We're going to try this in a little different format. It's up in a different part of the house. We're trying a big TV for screen mirroring and see if we can go through and talk about some major themes in anatomy and physiology. We'll see how the technology works. All right, so to begin this class, I think the first place you really need to be is here, okay? A and P. Like, you sign up for this A and P class, but what do these terms actually mean? And the first here, obviously, is anatomy. Okay, we're dealing with anatomy and physiology. When we say anatomy, what I want you to be thinking about is the parts and pieces. All right, anytime we go through, and we're going to talk about a system in the body and how it does what it does and how this all goes together and functions, we always start out by talking about the anatomy. Okay, the anatomy is the beginning part. You go through and you talk about the parts and pieces, how they are structured, how they fit together, what are they? We go through and talk about things like gross anatomy. Gross anatomy would be a conversation on very large things, visible to the naked eye. We could go through and talk about very small things, be that histology or cytology. Cytology being how we analyze like individual cells. Like we look at an individual cell, that's going to be cytology, looking at the internal structures within it. Talking about things like their cytoskeletal elements and how those function to make the cell overall do what it does, as opposed to histology. Histology is looking at whole tissues. So if we're examining the heart and we're looking at how the heart cells are grouped in unison with one another, which will then lead to their function, that will be histology, looking at whole tissues, like nervous tissue, like different muscular tissues, like the tissues that line your intestinal tract, all of that fun stuff, right? That's histology, tissues, versus cytology, which is looking at cells. And then, of course, there is systemic anatomy. Systemic anatomy is looking at the various systems of the body and what parts and pieces are there. And then eventually, well, I guess we're not quite there yet, but we can break down anatomy in a whole variety of ways. Like, I'm trying to throw a few at you just to get you in a decent position, but the idea is embryology would be, for example, looking at how cells change as they progress through different embryological steps towards production of a functioning organism, and then developmental anatomy would be looking at how an organism changes post-birth. So this embryology would be looking at anatomical variations pre-birth, so from fertilization to delivery, you might say, and then developmental anatomy is how the body changes post-birth. All right, so there's lots of these. Which would then lead us to a conversation on physiology. If anatomy is the parts and pieces and how they fit together, physiology is how they work for you. Okay, how they do what they do. What is the point? Why do you care that cardiac muscle cells have gap junctions? Well, because the physiology tells us that this allows those cells to then communicate, which lets your heart beat in unison so that you can pump blood. That's a great thing. These are all wonderful concepts. Physiology is how they do what they do, how things do their job. The anatomy is what it looks like. The physiology is the job that it does. And physiology, as you can see here, can get very complicated. This is just a brief, really it looks complicated, but this is a brief breakdown of how the kidneys and the nephrons, the functional units within the kidneys, sort of function to cleanse your blood of various waste products and other things. Okay, it's really just amazing. The anatomy is talking about Bowman's capsule and the loop of Henle and the convoluted tubules. The physiology would be talking about glomerular filtration, okay, and how it actually works. So anatomy versus physiology. So we could look at muscles, for example, and we will in this class be talking about the anatomy of muscles on a microscopic level, being composed of these little subunits of myosin and actin. And then we could talk about the physiology, describing how these myosin subunits are capable of attaching to the actin molecules and leading to motion. Okay, anatomy versus physiology. And really the reality to all this is the anatomy sort of constrains the physiology. Okay? In other words, what something looks like sort of can determine what it's capable of doing. And I'll give you some examples of that. Let's just roll right on through this. So my famous point to be made here is a description of the old hammer and wrench. Okay, now I consider myself pretty handy. There have been times in my life in which I have used a wrench to hammer things, and it doesn't work terribly well. A hammer works far better for driving nails than does a wrench, but I've never tightened or loosened a bolt by using a hammer. I've always had to use a wrench. In other words, these tools have very specific appearances. Their anatomy is very specific, and it constrains what they are capable of doing. Okay, their physiology. In the same way as your teeth and your bones. Their anatomy constrains their physiology. Now, on the surface, if I had a little piece of bone and a little piece of tooth, and I had them side by side, and they were both shined up and pretty, you'd have a hard time telling the difference. Feeling them, looking at them, what have you, you'd have a hard time understanding that they were different from one another. But they are very, very different indeed. You see, teeth, let's start there, are incredibly hard. The enamel on the outer surface of your teeth is actually the hardest substance that your body is capable of making. Much, much harder than bone. Bone is not even remotely as dense as is the enamel of your teeth. So why not just make your bones out of the same stuff as we make teeth? If the teeth are way harder, why not make bones out of the same thing? Well, the answer here is quite simple. When things are very, very hard, they also tend to be quite brittle. Okay? They also tend to be quite brittle. And imagine if your bones broke like glass. You may not realize this, but your bones are pretty flexible. Okay? Every time you take a step and move around, do the things that you do, your bones twist and move and bend just a little bit. Not a lot, but a little. And if your bones were as hard as your teeth, they would just snap immediately. They would break constantly, and your life would be a constant torment, okay? Which is not something we're shooting for here. So, and further, the whole structure of teeth prevents them from being able to heal themselves internally. So if you crack a tooth, it's not going to grow back together. That's not the way this works. So if you were to break a bone and it was made of the same stuff as teeth, break a bone, it's never growing back. That sounds like a problem, okay? Alternatively, why not then make your teeth the same thing we make bone from? That would be great. So if you crack a tooth, it heals back. Man, that would be wonderful. But there are other downsides here. You see, bone being a good bit softer and more malleable than is the material from which teeth are made, your teeth would wear down to little nubs in a very short time period. You can imagine being completely and utterly toothless by the time you're a teenager. And that also doesn't sound necessarily ideal. Now, what am I getting at here? What I'm getting at is that the anatomy of these structures somewhat determines what they're capable of doing, their physiology. Okay? How they are put together determines where they are best suited for function within our systems. Anatomy and physiology. And this is even true on microscopic scale. So what we have here is a Bowman's capsule from a kidney nephron, as I was describing to you previously. This is the capsule around the outside here, and this is called a glomerulus in the center. You'll be seeing this in lab as well. A good place to start. Lining this is an incredibly thin, like that's a cell. Here's the nucleus. The cell is, it looks like if you crack an egg and drop it on a frying pan, like if you were to look at the cross section of that, this very thin cell with a little nucleus here in the center. This lining goes all the way around. It's made of a type of tissue called simple squamous epithelium. Okay, simple squamous epithelium. Simple means one layer thick. Squamous means the cells are flat, and epithelium means it's a covering. And it's covering this Bowman's capsule. These cells are completely and utterly flat. I mean, they are thin, man. By comparison, over here, what we have is simple columnar epithelium. This is a nucleus of a cell, and the cell is quite tall. Here is the nucleus of the cell, and the cell is quite flat. The flattest, thinnest tissue your body makes, the tallest, thickest individual cellular tissue that your body makes. These have unique anatomy, as we just described, which gives them unique physiology, the things that they are capable of doing. This incredibly thin tissue here is wonderful for filtrative mechanisms, for allowing fluids to just flow right on through this and get through the body. It works like a charm for allowing things to pass quickly. This is not very selective. It lets lots of things through with great speed, okay, because it's so thin. Imagine making coffee, all right? You got a coffee filter. That filter is very, very thin for a reason, so things can get through it. It's going to stop some stuff, but not much, okay? Most is coming through. Imagine trying to filter your coffee with cardboard. Probably wouldn't work out so well. You see, you have other tissues in your body which are quite thick, like simple columnar epithelium, and they work up as a good barrier. The only things that get through this, those cells distinctly sampled for. They picked up on purpose and brought in via energy utilizing methods. Nothing just slides right through here, okay? Only certain materials are specifically absorbed by these cells and brought through these long cellular tracts all the way to the inner surface here. Okay? This is a barrier. Make no mistake. This is a barrier. It keeps stuff out. The material in here doesn't pass through easily, whereas here the material will pass through quite fast indeed. The anatomy, folks. The anatomy constrains the physiology. And that brings us to here. So what we have is the hierarchy of complexity. All right. How does this go? You are an organism, and boy, you better be friends with this, okay? You are an organism made up of many organ systems. Digestive system, reproductive system. Those systems are made up of individualized organs. You have a stomach, you have a liver, you have a pancreas. Those organs are made up of, definition, 2 or more tissues. An organ is made up of 2 or more different tissues working together towards a common goal. Wonderful definition for your exam. Tissues. 2 or more tissues in an organ. These tissues are going to be conglomerations of individual cells. So a tissue is going to be an area where you have cells of roughly the same type, generally speaking. So tissues are made up of cells. Cells are composed of organelles. All right, you being a eukaryotic organism. You will have various organelles within your cells which allow them to function and do work in a tissue. Okay, so cells made up of organelles. Those organelles are made up of what are called macromolecules. When we say macromolecules, what we're talking about is things like proteins and nucleic acids and lipids, you name it. These are macromolecules. Those macromolecules are huge. Macro means large. Okay, macromolecules, these massive molecules that are all composed of smaller parts called molecules, just molecules. And then those molecules, like here what we're looking at is probably water. That would be H2O. There you can see the 2 hydrogens and the oxygen in the core. These molecules then are composed of individual atoms. Get a couple of hydrogen atoms, bind it to an oxygen atom, you can make water. Okay? And let's not make it too much more complicated than that. So we have atoms to molecules, molecules to macromolecules, macromolecules to organelles, organelles to cells, cells to tissues, tissues to organs, organs to organ systems to an organism. Okay? Now, because of this, you have to grasp that the place that we're going to start, if we, at the end of Anatomy 1, at the end of Anatomy 2, want to have a good grasp of this organism and how it works, the place we have to start is at the bottom. Okay? The first test here in Anatomy and Physiology really is quite a bit of a review from Biology 1. I don't know when you took Biology 1. I don't know who you had for Biology 1, so I want to make darn sure that you understand how atoms come together to make molecules, how those molecules come together to make come together to make macromolecules, how these macromolecules organize themselves into organelles, into cells, into tissues, and then we can start talking about organs and how they all fit together. If you want to understand how your muscles do what they do, man, let me tell you, first you got to understand how those cells have internal cytoskeletal elements like actin and myosin. And if you want to understand how actin and myosin interact with one another, hey man, you really need to understand things like base bonding and proteins and peptide bonds. If you want to get that, boy, you really need to understand hydrogen bonding and tertiary and secondary structures. If you want to get that, You got to understand basic molecular bonds like covalent bonds, and if you understand that, you got to understand how atoms work and what valence shells are. So we got to start at the bottom. Okay, we're going to do like a full single lecture on chemistry to get us all where we need to be. We're going to do a full lecture on macromolecules so that you understand how these fit, and that'll get us up here where we need to be at the end. Okay, so we got to start somewhere. That somewhere is at the bottom. All right, where am I at? Organ systems cooperate to maintain life. Yeah, yes, this is all good stuff, but I don't really feel like talking through it right this second. Make sure. Yeah, I'm just not that concerned at this stage. Like, this is all good stuff, but let's just jump right on into here. Okay, let's run through these. This is the first of my family members you guys are going to meet. He was whining at the door wanting to come in, and rather than have you listen to him whine, I just let him in. Archie, say hi. We're going to talk about you a lot this semester. Yeah, that's right. Okay, stay there. All right, we need to talk about organ systems and how they're organized and what organs are involved in those organ systems. So what I need from you is to know the names of all your organ systems we're about to talk about. You need to know the basic organs that are involved in these, and you need to have a decent grasp of what all of them do. Okay, this is a nice primer on the body and the parts and pieces therein, so be friends with it. This dog, man. All right, the integumentary system is a wonderful place to start. When I ask people what the integumentary system is involved in, like, or the parts and pieces, I want you thinking like skin, hair, nails, your various glands, skin glands. Those are all going to be parts of the integumentary system. And what it does, people would say, is protection. Okay, but protection from what is a better question. So your integumentary system is wonderful for preventing damage from abrasion. Like, I can pick things up and handle them and end up with no damage to my skin surface, which is nice. I can bump into things, even sharp things, and my skin takes it. Okay, it's a wonderful protective device against abrasion. But also protection from sunlight, ultraviolet radiation. My skin has melanin that allows me to seal off my cells from the destructive effects of UV. My skin is a wonderful chemical barrier. So we come into contact with potentially dangerous chemicals constantly, and our skin is a barrier that keeps those out. Your skin's a biological barrier. If you get a cut, your chance of getting an infection is vastly increased. Your skin keeps bacteria and viruses out incredibly well. All right, incredibly well. Even now, with this crazy virus going around, you can get it on your hands all day long, and you'll probably fine as long as you wash them and don't touch your face or your mouth or something. It's crazy, but your skin is a wonderful barrier at keeping things out. These are considered cutaneous linings. Okay, cutaneous linings. That's your skin, your integumentary system. Next is your skeletal system. Parts and pieces, things like bones, right? Your various joints with cartilage, that's all going to be parts of the skeletal system. Your skeletal system has a number of roles. Your first comment would probably be to say that your skeletal system is involved in protection, which is true. Okay, your bones protect your internal organs, especially things like your lungs, your heart, your kidneys to some degree. Your skeletal system is certainly supportive. It helps you to hold your body up and gives your body its basic structure. Your skeletal system is going to be involved in fulcrum-based motions with your muscles to allow you to move. So all of this is involved. Okay, it's all involved. The muscular system, speaking of which, so the muscular system is going to be made up of muscles. Okay, and those muscles have a role to play, and that role is in allowing for movement. All right, the nervous system, a little bit more complicated. The nervous system is made up of things like your brain, your spinal cord. You have peripheral nerves, external nervous tissues elsewhere, sensory receptors, this kind of thing. So the nervous system's role is, well, let's be fancy, shall we? If I had to give you a book definition of what the role of the nervous system is, your nervous system allows you to perceive and respond to stimulation. Okay, perceive and respond to stimulation. That is the role of the nervous system. That's what it sort of does. Endocrine system. So the endocrine system is going to be involved in the manufacture of hormones. That's what it does. And the parts and pieces are pretty straightforward. Like we tend to think of things like testes and ovaries as making estrogens, testosterone, what have you. We think about the adrenal glands and releasing adrenaline. The pancreas releasing insulin. Your pituitary gland, your brain releasing growth hormone, allows you to grow taller. All of these are going to be involved in the endocrine system. And next on this page is the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular system is made up of your heart and your blood vessels. This is pretty obvious and very simple from my perspective. And its real role is to pump blood around the body. Okay, to move blood around the body. You could really just say transport and I'd be in good shape because we're just transporting things for the most part. And then there is, of course, the lymphatic system. Man, the lymphatic system is so cool, all right? What a neat structure, or group of structures, I should say. You probably have a grasp that you have lymph nodes. Okay, you have lymph nodes. You can kind of feel around in your neck. You can find some of these. If you dig in like the pits of, like not your armpits necessarily, they're a little hard, but like around your groin, it's the same basic story. You can feel these little bumps, if you will, underneath the skin, and those are lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are parts of the lymphatic system. And what the lymphatic system does is amazing. Okay, it's going to play two roles. One is fluid exchange, and we'll talk about what that means here in a second. And two is dealing with your immune system. Okay, so how does this all fit together? Well, it's going to go something like this. Every time your heart beats, you have a ventricular systolic event. Okay, the heart beats. That's systole, and then when it goes and relaxes, that's diastole. Systole, diastole, systole, diastole. And the idea is, if you were to measure all across the body, what you see is a pressure rise and a pressure drop, and a pressure rise and a pressure drop. And every time there's this pressure wave that comes flowing through your cardiovascular system, pumping blood, it pushes fluid through your blood capillaries out into your extraneous tissues. Now, when the wave comes back, it's almost like the ocean. Okay, the wave comes in, the wave comes back. When your heart rests, you go to diastole, most of the fluid that leaks out of your capillaries comes right on back into the cardiovascular system. But the trick is, not all of it. Some stays behind in the tissues. You have fluid buildup, just a little, okay, not much, just a little bit of fluid. Every time your heart beats, it builds up in your tissues. And if that fluid was allowed to build up and build up and build up and build up and build up, you would swell up like a balloon and die. In fact, if you've ever injured yourself, get a bee sting or twisted ankle, and the area swells, that swelling is due to fluid buildup in the immediate area. For reasons that we aren't going to get into right now, but that's what it is. What the lymphatic system's role is to take all that excess tissue fluid from all around the body, all that extraneous fluid that might build up and cause problems, absorb it, and dump it back into the cardiovascular system. Okay, picks up extraneous fluids, dumps it back into the cardiovascular system, and the world continues. Okay, the cycle continues. Now, while this fluid is being processed by the lymphatic system, it also gets tested for potential pathogens, bacteria, viruses, what have you, any foreign articles for that matter. So the lymphatic system is also hand in hand with your immune system. So that this fluid that's picked up from your extraneous tissues is going to be constantly tested for potential problems. Hey girl. I think that puts us to the respiratory system. Okay, so get back on task. The respiratory system, the idea here is this is made up of your lungs and your tracheal passages. The concept of the respiratory system is very simple. It allows for gas exchange. So your ideal is to breathe in oxygen that your cells need for cellular respiration. That is how we make ATP, how we make energy. And we exhale carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide which we exhale is a byproduct of cellular respiration. So for your mitochondria and your cells to conduct cellular respiration, what they really need is oxygen. That's the oxygen you're breathing. You're trying to breathe in that oxygen for a purpose. And as you get that oxygen, you bring it in, you release the waste product, the side effect of cellular respiration, which is carbon dioxide. Okay? It's what we do when we breathe. Take in oxygen, release carbon dioxide. All right, next is the digestive system. The digestive system is a little more complicated. We have the esophagus, and the liver and pancreas play a role here in making digestive fluids. You have a stomach and a small intestine and a large intestine. It's all involved. Okay, but the basic idea of the digestive system is to allow you to bring in food, digest it away, absorb nutrients, and eliminate the waste, the frass, the side materials that you can't use. So you bring in, get nutrients, get rid of what you don't use. And then last but not least of the major systems here is the urinary system. And the urinary system is so important. Holy cow, it is so important. Like, you don't even realize what all your urinary system does. People see this and they're like, oh, a couple of beans and a bag. No, really complicated. Your kidneys and your bladder, obviously, with the ureters connecting the three. Your kidneys, their role per se is to rid the body of nitrogenous waste. What do we mean? When we're going through and we're doing our cellular metabolism, the byproducts of cellular metabolism are nitrogenous waste products. Those are going to get into the blood, and they're going to flow all around the body in the blood, eventually to be picked up by the kidneys and eliminated as urine. So your urine is basically a homogenization, a concentration, I should say, of nitrogenous waste products and other bodily wastes. Okay, so this is going to be to eliminate nitrogenous waste from the body, but the kidneys play all kinds of other roles. You just wouldn't believe it. They're super complicated and super fascinating in ways that we are not going to talk about in Anatomy 1. That's an Anatomy 2 thing. But trust me when I say this is like one of my favorite systems in the body. It's very cool. I'll just give you a couple examples. Like, for instance, the number of red blood cells in your body is determined by your kidneys. Your kidneys have sensors which detect oxygen content of your blood. And if your blood oxygen content is too low, you'll start making more red blood cells to raise that. Or alternatively, well, yeah, let's leave it there. Okay, it's very fascinating. And then here at the end, we have systems which are used for the reproduction of more humans. This is quite simply male and female reproductive systems. For major organs, you can think about just being ovaries and testis. Ovaries making eggs, testis making sperm, those coming together, and then you got embryology followed by developmental biology. All right, perfect. Primary body cavities. You're going to see a lot of this in lab as well, but I'll go ahead and hit it now. I'll probably be quoting myself a million times in lab, but that's just life, how this semester goes. What we have here is a dorsal cavity housing the brain and spinal cord. By the way, good place to stop if you need to take a little break. Anyway, dorsal cavity made up of the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. This is going to house the brain and spinal cord. And then a ventral cavity. This ventral cavity housing a thoracic cavity up top. All of this would be considered thoracic. A diaphragm here, which is smooth muscle. Their ladybug flew through. You know where that sucker came from. Teaching from home. Alright, the diaphragm is actually made of skeletal muscle. I don't know what I said previously, but it's going to allow you to breathe. So your diaphragm will flex and pull air into the lungs and relax to let air out of the lungs. Below this is the abdominal cavity, which houses things like your liver and your pancreas and your small intestine, your large intestine, your stomach. And then below that is the pelvic cavity, which houses reproductive organs. Now, the thoracic cavity is further subdivided into a pair of pleural cavities, mediastinum, and the pericardial cavity. Pleural cavities. From now on, anytime you hear pleura, I want you thinking lungs. Okay, the pleura are the lungs. Pleural cavities house the lungs. Next, we need to talk about the various serosas. So the serous membranes here are very, very important for us. And people really struggle with this, so pay attention, folks. This is so important. So important. Your organs have a double-layer serous membrane which protects them. A double-layer serous membrane set which protects them. They are named. They are called the parietal serosa and the visceral serosa. Or, it's really a little more complicated than that. Let's go from there, okay? So, parietal versus visceral. Parietal means around, okay? Parietal means around. In boxing parlance, if somebody's coming at you and you shift to a side, that's a parry, okay? Parietal, parry, means to the side of something, okay? To the side of something. Whereas visceral means attached to the organ. Viscera means organ, so the visceral lining is on the organ itself. Now, let's give an example, like your heart. Okay, your heart has a parietal pericardium, cardio, heart. Okay, pericardial, that means heart. Your heart has a parietal pericardium and a visceral pericardium. Your lungs have a parietal pleura and a visceral pleura. Your intestines have a parietal peritoneum and a visceral peritoneum. Now, heart, pericardium. The visceral pericardium, all right, visceral pericardium, it is on the heart like skin on a grape, man. Visceral pericardium, it is attached to that heart. It is on it. It is attached. Skin on a grape. Whereas the parietal pericardium, okay, around the parietal pericardium, is going to be kind of like attached to the body wall, forming a little chamber in which the heart sits. Parietal pericardium is the chamber where the heart sits. It lines the chamber. The visceral pericardium is on the heart itself. And what that means is there is a gap between the two, a space. There's a space between the two. And this is very, very important for us, man. It's super important. This space allows, well, first things first, the space is filled with a fluid called serous fluid. Okay, it's a serous membrane that makes serous fluid. And serous fluid is basically a lubricant. Like I can kind of shimmy side to side and I can feel the weight in my chest. Like I can feel the inertial movements of my heart in my chest. I can feel it. Like if you sit there and you concentrate, you can feel that motion because your heart is a big, hard structure. Right? If I had a heart and I threw it to you, I could knock you off a chair. Right? Like a pancreas or something like that, they're basically like cottage cheese. But these are big, heavy, hard structures. Okay? And you can feel them moving around. And if they were moving around without this system in place, they could build up friction and that could lead to damage. But the idea of having a parietal and visceral pericardium with serous membrane between the two, or a serous fluid I should say, it allows the heart to move around in a lubricated space so there's no friction. Same story with the lungs, parietal and visceral pleura. You know, your lungs are constantly expanding and relaxing and expanding and relaxing. To do this, they have to have this serous membrane, this lubricant, that allows them to move around without being damaged. Okay? Same thing with your peritoneum. Your intestines are constantly in flux. They're moving and squeezing and doing what they do. They have to have this system in place, the serous membrane system, a parietal pericardium and a visceral pericardium to allow them to do what they do. A parietal pleura and a visceral pleura, a parietal peritoneum and a visceral peritoneum. This is very, very important. Okay, these membrane systems are very, very important. And that is to say that all these organ systems, they are quite connected to one another. Okay, they are quite connected. You breathe in air to run your metabolism that comes in from your respiratory system, gets into your blood. Your blood then carries carbon dioxide back to your lungs, and you exhale carbon dioxide, so oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, flowing through the cardiovascular system, circulatory system, delivering the oxygen, picking up wastes, nutrients to power the system coming in from your digestive system, all the breakdown products of those nutrients from metabolism leaving via your urinary system, everything housed by an integumentary system. Man, you got lining. It's an amazing process. Okay, it's really quite an amazing process. And that is to say that all of these systems have to be working together in unison to keep your body functional, to keep you balanced, In fact, balanced is a good term here. Now, let me throw a couple of things at you. All the vital mechanisms, however varied they may be, have only one objective, that of preserving constant the conditions of life in the internal environment. Okay, this is the 1860s, Claude Bernard. Preserving constant the conditions of life in the internal environment. You have to keep your internal environment roughly constant. Your blood sugar can't vary that much for you to stay healthy. Your body temperature, if it goes up or down a few degrees, you feel very different. You have to maintain constant your internal environment. All of these systems have to be working together constantly to keep you balanced. That leads us to Walter Cannon in the 1960s. The coordinated physiological processes which maintain most of the steady states in the organisms are so complex and peculiar to living beings that I have suggested a specific designation for these states, that is, homeostasis, from this point forward. Folks, we have a conversation on homeostasis. Homeostasis is a state of internal sameness. You have to maintain your body temperature. You have to maintain your blood sugar levels. You have to maintain your calcium levels. All of this must be stable, or you got problems. Okay? You die because you fail to maintain homeostasis. That's how this works. Okay? Maintaining homeostasis is the end goal of all of this. So let's discuss. Homeostasis, recognizing limits, the ability of the body to maintain relatively stable internal conditions despite changes in the external environment. This is going to be done by your nervous system and your endocrine system. Okay? Your nervous system by directly regulating things using the brain, your endocrine system by releasing specific hormones. For instance, your brain, well, let's not get into that too deep. Let's start at the simplistic side of things. Something in your body is going to move out of whack. Okay? Some sort of stimulus causes a deviation from a given set point. The famous example that I always use, because it makes better sense to you, is body temperature. Your body temperature is 98.6 degrees. You know this. Okay? 98.6. Dedicate to memory. If something happens to drive you up or down from this, your body's going to have to take steps to bring you back into homeostatic balance. Okay? If you, well, hang on. Let's just stick to the script here, shall we? Now, the reality is that we normally don't have a perfect equilibrium. Okay? When I say that your body temperature is 98.6, man, I'm here to tell you that it probably isn't. Right at this moment, it may be a little high or a little low. But if you swallow a pill that's a thermometer and it measures your core body temperature throughout the course of a day, it'll average 98.6. Like when you lay down at night, you may be a little hot. When you wake up in the morning, you may be a little cold. But on average, you're going to be around 98.6. We call this being in dynamic equilibrium. Homeostasis is dynamic equilibrium. You are not exactly 98.6 degrees, but you're pretty freaking close. And if something happens to push you out of that homeostatic balance, then you will be pulled back in through homeostatic mechanisms. So let's look at some examples. Afferent versus efferent. Afferent and efferent. These are terms you need to commit to memory. Okay, these are important. Afferent messages travel from some sort of sensory receptor to a control center, which makes a determination on what needs to be done, which will then send an efferent message out to some effectors. These are going to be structures of the body that bring about changes, and that brings us back into homeostatic balance. Now, that's a mouthful. Let me give this to you in a easily digested format. Here's the wife and I with our little man, Archie, back in the day, pre-children. Okay, this was in Northport when it snowed real bad about 7 or 8 years ago. Okay, man, let me tell you, cold, cold, cold. We went out, and you can guarantee that our core body temperatures begin to drop. I mean, we're in freezing cold temperatures. Your core temperature is going to drop when this happens. But does it keep dropping, leading you into hypothermia and certain death? No. No, of course not. You see, when my body detected an imbalance, my core temperature beginning to drop, the receptors in my core picked this up and sent an afferent message to my brain. My brain then says, oh, we're getting cold, we better do something about this. So they send an efferent message out to various effectors of the body, which would then lead to the raising of my core body temperature. If I began to get very, very cold indeed, what would start happening? You shiver. And what you don't know is, shivering is your body's way of using your muscles to generate heat. Muscle flexion generates massive quantities of bodily heat. And you know this. Because if you pause this video right now, leave wherever you're sitting, go and find whatever building you're probably in, and sprint as fast as you can run in a circle around it, and then come back to the chair you're in right now, you're going to be hot. You're going to be sweating. Because muscle flexion generates heat. Shivering generates heat. This is a homeostatic process. It's keeping you balanced. You're going to be exactly 98.6 degrees? No, but you're going to be close. Okay, you're going to be close. And the same thing can be done with being in heat, for that matter. And we'll get there in just a second. Uh-oh. Technical difficulties. There we go. Boy, if we had time on our hands, I'd tell you about banthing and best. But I predict that you want this done in a concise manner, as opposed to telling long stories that aren't necessarily going to be on your tests. I would invite you to pause this video and go and look up Frederick Banting's contributions towards insulin development. These folks were pivotal in saving millions and millions and millions of lives. Very important. All right, what's next? All right, the idea of homeostasis. Okay, the idea of homeostasis that we have been presenting, that something happens to bring your body out of alignment in terms of dynamic equilibrium, and your body takes steps to bring it back down. Or something happens to push you down, and your body takes steps to bring it back up. Your blood sugar levels begin to rise, so you release insulin to bring it back down. Your blood sugar levels begin to drop, so you release glucagon to bring it back up. These are all descriptors, if you will, of what are called negative feedback loops. Okay, negative feedback loops. The way that your book describes this is by talking about like a thermostat. If you set your thermostat, let's see, it's summertime. Let's just give us a good round number. Let's say 75 degrees. Okay, 75 degrees. Let's say you set it at 75. Does that mean that your house is going to be exactly 75 degrees all day long, every single day? No, not even remotely true. The idea is that it's hot outside, so the temperature in the house would go to 75, 76, 77, and then it'll cut the AC on and it'll bring it down to like 73, then it'll go to 74, 75, 76, 77, cut the AC on, bring it back down. What's happening here is there is a driving force, sunlight, that is going to heat the building, and as the building heats, there's going to be a system that cuts on and brings that temperature back down. Okay? That is negative feedback. Your body does this all the time. I'll give you two good examples. These are going to be involving the words vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Okay, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Now, let's think about this. My goodness. Vaso means veins, like arteries and veins. Vasoconstriction. Constrict means to get smaller. Okay, to constrict means to get smaller. Dilation, vasodilation. To dilate means to get bigger, all right? If you vasodilate blood vessels, that means they're going to get larger in diameter, more blood goes through them. If you vasoconstrict blood vessels, the vessels get smaller in diameter, and less blood can flow through them. Okay, it's just how this works. Now, if I go outside and I start running around and acting crazy, man, let me tell you, I'm going to get really hot, and if I come back in and look at my skin, like me and my Scottish heritage, Northern England, I produce very little melanin. What you're going to see is that I would be just pink, okay, pink. And the reason I would look pink is because it's very, very hot, and my blood vessels and my skin surface would dilate like crazy. They would have lots of blood coming to the surface of the body, and that blood would carry heat with it, and it would radiate off of my bodily surface. You may not realize this, but your core is incredibly hot. When we say 98.6 degrees, you don't realize how hot that actually is. Okay, the outside air temperature is much lower in almost every case. Okay, so by sending blood out to the surface of the body via vasodilation, we can cool the body down relatively effective. And if you get really, really hot, you really, really vasodilate those blood vessels. What that's going to do is it's going to send so much blood into the skin, it activates your sweat glands. And when you activate your sweat glands, that evaporative cooling process really cools you down fast. Okay, really cools you down. And then by comparison, vasoconstriction. If you get cold, where do you notice it first? Okay, my wife, she never has to tell me when she's cold. She just walks up and touches her nose to my cheek. I'm like, okay, you're freezing. Here's my jacket. Okay, the concept is you tend to notice this in your extremities. Your hands, your arms, your feet, your legs. This is where you first notice the cold. Your nose, perhaps. The reasoning for this is very simple. If you're very cold, if your core temperature begins to drop, to go hypothermic, what your body will do is you will vasoconstrict the blood vessels to go to the skin surface. Specifically, you'll notice this in the thinner areas of the body, like the fingers and the toes first. When you cut blood flow off to the skin there, those areas get very cold indeed, and you will notice and you will feel it. But the idea is that if you cut blood flow off to the skin, it's going to conserve your core body temperature, the heat internally. It's fine if you lose a finger or two as long as you stay alive, all right? So this is how we do it. And if you get very, very cold indeed, you will start to shiver, as we described a few moments ago. Perfect. All right, I'm not so concerned with this. Sometimes these feedback loops don't quite go the way we'd like. Come on. All right, and then, of course, positive feedback loops. So everything we've described at this stage has been a negative feedback loop. Negative feedback loops are prevalent and pretty much all we see in the bodily system. Something happens to bring you up. Like there's a variable that makes your core temperature rise, so your body works to bring it back down. Your blood sugar levels begin to drop because you haven't eaten anything lately, so you release glucagon, and that brings your blood sugar levels back up. Okay, something drops, so you bring it back up. Something rises, so you bring it back down. That's negative feedback. It works in the opposite direction. Positive feedback works toward, like, away. You're starting an avalanche. Okay, you start that avalanche, and it's coming down the mountain. There is no stopping it once it begins. That is positive feedback. Positive feedback is more seen in the ecological field. No pun intended for what I'm about to say. We think about this in like cattle grazing, for example. You put cows in a field that doesn't have much grass, so they eat the grass that's there, and then there's no grass. So they start pawing up the ground and eating the roots of the grass and eating any seeds they can find. And what's going to happen there is no grass will ever grow, at least not for a long, long time, because it's been so overgrazed. They graze a little bit, which means there's less food, so they graze whatever else they can find, so there's less food and less and less and less, until there is no food and everything dies. That's positive feedback. Now, the human body doesn't do this directly. The positive feedback mechanisms of the body are more like inadvertent. They're parts of what would eventually be considered negative feedback mechanisms. But I'll give you the examples I can think of. So the two that really come to mind deal with childbirth and blood clotting. Okay, when you get a cut, you have these local, what are called paracrine hormones in the blood vessels, in the areas of damage. They're basically going to be found inside the walls of your vessels, these paracrine hormones. And when you are cut and blood flows through these areas, they're going to stimulate for platelets to pile up, which eventually will lead to blood clotting. Okay, you've seen this happen. You cut yourself, and it drips, and it drips, drip, 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 stops bleeding. Okay, that's blood clotting. What's actually happening there is these paracrine hormones signal for platelets to stick together. So the platelets are flowing through, they find the area of damage, and rather than just flowing out the blood, they get sticky and they stick to the wall of the artery. And then those platelets release chemical hormones, or chemical compounds, I should say, which stimulate for more platelets to pile up. Okay, so then those platelets come in and they stick together. And then once they're there, they signal for more platelets, and then more platelets pile up, which signals for more platelets, and then more platelets, and more platelets, and more, and more, and more, and more, and more, and more, until eventually, blood clot, you get a platelet plug, and healing can begin. The idea is that a few platelets call for more platelets, call for more platelets, call for more platelets. And the goal here is to stop blood loss. Okay? But for a short time period, that's positive feedback. A better example, I think, is childbirth. So what happens is quite simplistic here. Well, simple being a poorly used word. It's amazing is what it is. I've seen it 3 times. An amazing process. What happens is, once the kid's full term, kid begins to move down towards the birth canal. The head of the child pushes against the cervix. And as the head of the kid pushes against the cervix, this causes a nervous transmission. It goes up to the brain from the cervix and stimulates the brain to release a hormone called oxytocin. Okay, oxytocin. Oxytocin is released by the brain. It goes into the bloodstream. It flows all around the body, but the target cells that have the appropriate receptors for oxytocin are in the uterus. And guess what this causes? A contraction. The uterus squeezes and relaxes. Well, what does that squeezing do? It pushes the kid's head against the cervix, which then sends a stronger message to the brain. That stronger message to the brain causes the release of even more oxytocin. Faster this time. Goes back into the body. Hits the uterus. Causes a stronger uterine contraction, which sends an even stronger message to the brain, which then releases even more oxytocin, which causes an even stronger contraction. Nervous transmission, oxytocin. Nervous transmission, oxytocin. Uterine contractions, pressure against the cervix. Uterine contractions, pressure against the cervix. You go to the doctor when you're getting ready to have a baby, it's the first thing they ask. They say, how close together are your contractions? How long are they? Because they're trying to figure out where along the path you are. You ever heard of somebody being induced? They're piping in oxytocin. I mean, it's a chemical variant, but it's the same thing. It stimulates the uterine contractions. This process is going to cause contraction, 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 contraction until that kid is pushed out of there and we enter developmental biology. Okay? It's an amazing process. A little bit of pressure leads to more pressure. Then a lot of pressure leads to even more pressure, which leads to more pressure, more pressure, more pressure until you get a child. That's positive feedback. For a short time period, and we're headed somewhere, we're trying to get a kid out, that's positive feedback. And it's a really amazing process. Alright, good. These set points can indeed be dynamic. For instance, your body temperature does vary over the course of a day. That's a fact. Let's see, what else do we want to say? Oh yeah, we got to talk about some visualization, and then I think we're pretty well done. Alright, so I'm going to do this quick. X-rays are very simple. X-rays basically allow us to see overlapping hard structures. Like I can see bones pretty well, but I can't tell you what your heart's doing. Okay? X-rays are wonderful, they're fast, but they don't give you a lot of detail. You can basically just see contrast of light and dark. They're not very complicated. We can use a modification of this called a CT scan. CT scans are when we take basically X-rays all around the body in circles, and then we use a computed tomography, to compile these into a file that allows us to be able to more readily make out soft structures internally. But what I want you to notice about a CT scan, one, this happens very quickly. CT scan, you're looking at a couple minutes. You know, this is a fast process. And two, the detail's not very good. Like, you can see some detail, but it ain't a lot. Okay, it's not perfect. But then we have an MRI. Now, an MRI, the downside of an MRI is it takes a long time to do. You know, you might be sitting in a chair for an hour or in a tube for an hour to get a good MRI scan done. But with an MRI, we can make up just beautiful details. Oh, that's just amazing. Anywhere there's a lot of water in the body, an MRI works like a charm. This does away with... Sorry, guys. Minor technical difficulties. All right. Finishing up, so an MRI, the downside of this is it takes a long time to run a good MRI scan, but the upside is that it really just gives you beautiful internal images. We can even modify this. Like, this is a set of lungs. Person was breathing in magnetized particles, and they ran this MRI for a period of time and were able to compile a function of their lungs and how their lungs were expanding and if they're working correctly. It's amazing. It's really amazing stuff. Right, and then there are, of course, PET scans or positron emission tomographies. A PET scan is where we inject a radioactive dye, in essence, or a radioactive particle that binds to other particles. Where we tend to use this is the radioactive material is attached to a biological molecule that is readily taken up by the body. And in essence, anywhere there are tissues that are working overtime, working really hard, they will metabolize more of this radioactive material than will other tissues. In other words, this helps us find potentially cancerous areas, like tumors, for example, would be very, very active. This helps us to locate those. Also, this can be used to diagnose a stroke within the brain. If there's an area of the brain that isn't getting any of this radioactive tracer, then it's a pretty good way of looking at potentially an area that's not getting blood flow, a stroke. And at the high end of the spectrum, there are fMRIs. So an fMRI is a functional magnetic resonance image. This is a situation where, in essence, we look at the amount of oxygen in the tissues, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sure I've got this in here someplace, but anyway, deoxygenated tissues will look different to an fMRI than will oxygenated tissues. Tissues that are being utilized by the body look different than tissues that are not necessarily being utilized by the body in an fMRI. And this is incredibly accurate. What we can do with this is just mind-blowing. So you can have a person that's having an fMRI scan done on the brain. You can tell them to visualize a blue square. And they'll think about a blue square. And you'll see the area of the brain light up that allows them to interpret voice. The area of the brain light up that allows them to visualize. If I say, think about your childhood, you'll see the hippocampus light up with memory. It's just amazing. Like, this is wild stuff. We use this to diagnose potential brain injuries. It's really easy to diagnose stroke damage using this. You can look at areas of the brain that are working and areas that are not. It's very fascinating. Just a very, very fascinating, wonderful tool to use. And that, folks, that's that. So let's stop there. And that is the end of the first chapter of Anatomy and Physiology. All right, thanks, guys.